Hi, everybody. Welcome to our weekly NASCAR Fantasy Racing Hangout. This is Dan Beaver's Fantasy Racing Pit Stop. This week for the big race in Loudon, New Hampshire at New Hampshire Motor Speedway. I'm Charlie Turner, and I'm joined by NASCAR Racing Fantasy Racing Guru Dan Beaver. How are you today, Dan?
I'm doing great.
All right,
As
so we're
usual.
going back to one of your tracks, one of the tracks you actually like. We could push that whole Daytona thing and the plate track thing out of the way, and we go to a track that's somewhat predictable, and the racing is likable, I guess. And tell us about New Hampshire Motor Speedway.
Well, we've got more streaks. The flat tracks in general just tend to be more prone to streaks. New Hampshire is right up there with them. They've got more top 15 streaks, top 10 streaks, top 5 streaks in the past 3 or 4 years than pretty much any other track, at least more consistently. Occasionally, a track will pop up there. And one of the reasons for that is the two races are relatively close to one another. They're not as close as Pocono. They're not as close as Michigan, but the two races are right there together. And we seem to get a nice little clump of flat track races during the middle of the summer and the beginning of the fall. So I think the drivers get a chance to develop some of their rhythm, some more rhythm on this track type. So that's always nice. I think one reason that this race seems to be more predictable as well is because right now we're coming off the heels of such an unpredictable race that anything seems like just a breath of fresh air for that reason. So also the short flat tracks, we've got Phoenix, Martinsville, and Richmond that we've already run. We've got a couple of drivers who have either swept the top 10 or swept the top 15 in those races. So they're carrying that momentum with them. Phoenix was way at the beginning of the season, and Phoenix is the most comparable track to New Hampshire. But you can also get some good information from Martinsville and Richmond if the trend remains solid. If the trend or the streaks are spotty, you have to look and see why. And sometimes Richmond can behave like an unrestricted intermediate speedway, so you get some of those drivers that do well at the similarly configured mile and a half tracks, popping up into the top 10. Martinsville is one of the smallest tracks, so sometimes you get some short track specialists popping up in there that aren't necessarily flat track specialists. But for the most part, those two tracks, along with Phoenix and New Hampshire, can be lumped together and treated as one track type.
Well, okay. All that said, so we have looking at let's talk about a salary cap game like the NASCAR.com game. What's your strategy this week? I mean, what's the strategy you recommend this week?
Well, this week we've got a pretty nice gift in the form of Jeff Burton taking over the number 66. So he's only had one race under his belt. He's going to be cheap for that reason. Eddie McDonald in the number 32 is probably going to be a good driver in a salary cap game. He's going to come in at a bargain basement price most places, whatever the bottom cap is, or just barely off the bottom cap. And the number 32 has been good for some consistent 30-something finishes. So if you can round out your roster with a very cheap driver who probably will finish somewhere in the 30s, that makes some sense. If it allows you to take someone else, take two marquee drivers at the top, take both Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Jeff Gordon at the top of the salary cap, or Jimmy Johnson, or any two of those three. So that's probably the best thing we've got going for us this week. Then you've got a few drivers like David Gilliland, who's been pretty consistent on flat tracks, short flat tracks, but he ran into trouble last week. Everybody was thinking about starting him last week and maybe did at Daytona. Now, since he got involved in that crash, they may have dumped him, and that's going to give you an opportunity to get someone good and cheap on your roster. Cole Witt, I believe. Let me see if it's the right driver I've got in mind. No. One of the rookies was at Allgaier. One of the rookies is a pretty good pick as well, Justin Allgaier. Started off a little bit soft with the 30th at Phoenix, but then he had a 23rd and a 21st at Richmond. So another good salary cap pick if you're looking at the bottom. And this week, I would start setting my roster from the very bottom and then fill it in at the top. Look for Burton. Look for Eddie McDonald, perhaps. Look for either Allgaier or Gilliland. And then you're going to have a lot of money at the very top. Fill in those top two places, and then look and see if any of those bottom three drivers in a five-man cap game can be upgraded to another marquee driver, or certainly are better than mid-cap driver.
With these, with the low dollar drivers that are available in these games, are you looking? What's a win there? Is it top 30? Is that what you're looking for?
A win for a driver. Let's take the NASCAR.com game for example. You've got drivers down in the $5-6 range, $7 range. A win in that range is anywhere in the 30s even. A top 35 would be a good pick there if they qualify badly and improve during the race, where NASCAR.com offers a place differential bonus. For a mid-cap driver, someone that's in the $12 to $20 range, yeah, you really want them to finish somewhere in the 20s. And you want them to finish predictably in the 20s. Allgaier, 23rd and 21st. That's a pretty, it's only 2 races, but it's a significant enough trend that you could expect that. Landon Castle didn't qualify at Phoenix, but he finished 25th and 26th at Martinsville and Richmond. So he could be another one of those drivers that could finish in the 20s and be worth his salary cap in that same range. Then at the top, you're looking, you want your marquee drivers to be capable of winning and leading laps. So you're going to put Kevin Harvick on there most weeks. Recently, Jeff Gordon's got the hot hand. He's got the best average finish, leading the points. So Jeff Gordon's going to be up there. Regardless of where he qualifies, even if he falls back a little bit, he's going to make up for that in some of the other categories, like the finishing position.
Is there, who do you stay away from? I mean, there's every week, I would say probably almost every race, there's 3 or 4 drivers that you just, if they're on your roster, you want to dump them.
At the moment, I'd stay away from Kyle Larson. 3 bad finishes in a row has got to start playing on his confidence just a little bit. It's probably worth leaving him in the garage for a week to see how fast he's going to rebound. And if he rebounds immediately this week, then you may have left a little bit on the table, but it's worth waiting a race or two. This week, I would avoid Denny Hamlin. He's a flat track master. He should be strong on every flat track out there, but his best finish this year is a pair of 19ths at Martinsville and Phoenix on this track type. And dating back to his return from his injury last year, he only has 2 top 15s in, how many races is that? 7 races, I believe? 8. Has 2 top 15s in 8 races. And the rest of his finishes are 19th or worse. So he seems to have lost his mojo on the short flat tracks. And if he couldn't get it done at Martinsville or Richmond, his home state tracks, he's probably not going to get it done at New Hampshire. So those are a couple of drivers I would avoid.
And avoiding Hamlin's probably one of those good strategy plays, too, because there's still going to be a lot of people that will look at loop stats or whatever, and they're going to say, Denny Hamlin, New Hampshire, got to take Denny Hamlin. He's going to be an automatic, so you can kind of take the arbitrary look and go away from him with somebody else that's had more success this year.
Yeah, definitely. And even if you're not looking at the stats, just in the back of your mind, anybody who's been playing this game for a little while knows Denny Hamlin is great on flat tracks.
Right.
But it's just not working out this year, and that happens from time to time. We had Carl Edwards finishing 7th or better on Michigan and Auto Club for years and years, and then he started to stumble there. So you can be forgiven for missing that the first time it happens. But when it becomes a trend, even if it's a small trend, you have to pay attention to it, and you have to play a little more conservatively.
Okay. Any other considerations for the salary cap type game this week, or before we move on to the big dog in the room, the Yahoo game?
No, just make sure that you change your roster from last week. These are two totally different tracks. You can't place and hold. If you had dark horses on your roster last week that were good plate drivers or just wild picks, make sure you get them off of your roster and go with dark horses that are specific to short flat tracks.
Okay, so now we go to Yahoo game. What's the strategy there? In the salary cap game, you started with the drivers on the bottom and worked your way up. Probably not as much of a consideration when you're playing the A, B, and C game in Yahoo.
Yeah, you got to treat each of the levels as its own entity. B is always a little more challenging because it's more prone to exhausting drivers than either A or C. In C, you've got Kyle Larson, Austin Dillon, maybe Danica Patrick. You have to plot that out going forward. In A, you're looking for drivers that have current momentum, and that shifts throughout the year. So you're going to be looking right now for the top 300 drivers almost every week. But you know that going in, so you can play your allocation management game accordingly. And then whenever you've got Harvick run on a run, or you've got Kyle Busch looking like he's set to sweep a weekend, you can move those into the top spot and save your allocations for those other marquee drivers. But in B, because you've got two drivers that you have to start, it's a lot easier to forget what you're doing. It's a lot easier to try to place and hold someone like Joey Logano or Brad Keselowski that are doing so well for a period of time. And you've got to fight against that tendency, and you've got to look for that next tier of drivers. But it still doesn't impact what you're going to do in Group A or Group C. Group B is going to perform on its own. So you might as well just start at the top and decide who your Group A driver is going to be. You're looking for a driver with the capability of winning. Earlier this week on the on pit row hangout, I picked Dale Earnhardt Jr., I believe, to win at New Hampshire.
Yes, you did.
Nothing's changed my mind since then. He's got the hot hand on short flat tracks at the moment with 6 consecutive top 10s, 3 of which were top 5s, the worst of which was an 8 last year at Martinsville. His last couple of New Hampshire races have been in the top 15 range, but he has more momentum now than he did last year. So I think he at least keeps his top 8 streak alive, and given the right set of circumstances, I think he's got the capability to win. Jeff Gordon has an extremely long streak of top 15 finishes, both at New Hampshire, going back to 2005, I believe, and on short flat tracks, going back to the beginning of last year. His worst finish was a 15th at New Hampshire. But again, he's got momentum on his side with a 5th at Phoenix and a 2nd at Richmond. So Jeff Gordon is probably going to be Earnhardt's principal rival, with that same caveat that we say every week. He's not going to be a good pick if it has the short green flag run at the end because of his inability to restart. But eventually, he'll get that out of his system and become a predictably good value on tracks like this again. But until then, even a bad finish for Gordon, even a bad finish is probably a top 10. And if you're playing the odds, playing the numbers, decent driver to start. He's going to be one of the top 4 Group A drivers with that, in all likelihood.
Well, you mentioned that your A drivers, you're looking for a driver who's capable of winning. Certainly, Junior and Jeff Gordon are capable this week. Jimmy Johnson, you mentioned earlier in the show as being a potential pick for A. What you say a bad finish for Jeff Gordon would be a top 10 at least. What do you consider? Goes back to my salary cap question. What's a win for an A driver here? I mean, you're looking, if you're outside the top 10, do you consider that a lose for your A pick?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you got a driver that even finishes in the top 15, you're probably not going to be happy with the points result, because he's going to get beaten by another 4 or 5 or 6 Group A drivers. At any given time, the top 10 is going to be at least half Group A drivers. So you got to have one of those drivers, and you figure that should be easy enough to predict. It's a 50-50 chance out of a 9-10 man group that you could get one of the 5 that are going to finish in the top 10. But in today's age of parity, that is not a given. So what I do is I go back and I look for those streaks. Kevin Harvick could be another driver. He hasn't been particularly strong at New Hampshire throughout his career, or at least recently at New Hampshire, but he does have those 2 victories at Phoenix in their last 2 races. So it means that he can perform well on slick 1 mile flat tracks. So he might get put on your roster alongside of an Earnhardt, a Gordon, or a Johnson, so that you can start one of those if it doesn't appear that he's strong in practice. But Harvick's this year has been a good driver for tipping his hand in preliminaries. He tips his hand in practice. He tips his hand in qualification. So if he does well in those sessions, you probably want to activate him on Sunday. But you can only do that in the Yahoo game if you've got it in your provisional roster tonight before tomorrow's qualification session.
So, okay, so now we haven't really talked about the B drivers much. Same question, same kind of question. What's a win for your B driver? Or is it obviously there's a bigger spread of what you'd accept there, more drivers that are collecting points as well?
Yeah, I think you're looking for a top 15 finish from your B driver. And this year we've got about as many winners coming out of Group B as we do coming out of Group A. So ideally, you're going to get that driver who wins or finishes in the top 5. But if he finishes in the top 15, he's going to be in the top half of the group, and that's going to be a decent points day. Then you have to start thinking about allocation management. You can't start Keselowski and Logano every week. So you're going to have to move them off your roster at some time or another. This can be a good week to do it, although both of them have had extremely strong runs on short flat tracks this year. Both of them would have swept the top 5 if Keselowski hadn't run into Kurt Busch in the pits. He had a strong car. He would have finished 5th at Martinsville back at the beginning of the season, and he would have swept the top 5 just as Joey Logano swept the top 5 at Phoenix, Martinsville, and Richmond. So if you are playing that kind of game, you're going to kind of switch gears and say, okay, that's top 5 finishes are great. I'm going to ride Keselowski and the Penske guys on short flat tracks and kind of forget about them on the unrestricted intermediate speedways. But they've been strong there too, so it's a little bit of a conundrum. You just points are points. You get them where you can get them, and if it looks like those guys can have top 5s, then it's a good time to go ahead and use up one of those allocations. So this week in Yahoo, I've got Brad Keselowski ranked number 1. I think I've got Logano ranked number 5th or so, mostly because of allocation management and because his top 5 streak this year isn't backed up by an equally consistent run last year. So spread in, or salted in between, I've got Carl Edwards, Ryan Newman, and Greg Biffle. Edwards has been strong, consistent top 15 finishes on short flat tracks. So if a top 15 is a good finish for a Group B driver, and you've got a driver that you think can almost guarantee you a top 15 finish, he's pretty safe to start. So that's what Edwards is doing there. Ryan Newman is another of those drivers that's been pretty consistent on the short flat tracks this year. Looking up getting the numbers directly in front of me. He had a bad race at Martinsville, but dating back to last year's Phoenix, he's finished in the top 10, between 7th and 10th in 3 of the last 4 short flat track races. And he's not one that's going to immediately come to mind. Supporting that, you've got a top 10 sweep by Jeff Burton last year in the same car. So the team's got a good set of notes. Newman has a good set of notes. He should finish somewhere in that 6th to 10th place range again this week.
Anybody that you would normally anybody that you've not used a lot in B this year that you look at specifically at this racetrack for any reason?
Vickers could be that driver. This is one of the courses that Martin never didn't come to during his off season. So Vickers continued to run here. He never got rusty, and that paid off. He won this race last year, which might have been just a little bit of an anomaly, but he also has a 5-race top 15 streak, 4 of which are top 10s, 2 of which are top 5s, and last year's victory. So Vickers is not the driver that probably is going to come to mind first thing on this track, but a nice solid pick. It's kind of notable that he won this race and finished 7th in the fall race, whereas the driver who won the fall race finished 9th in this race. So even though this has been, there've been some nice top 10 streaks here, only one driver managed to sweep the top 5 last year, and that was Kyle Busch. The reason he didn't get called out earlier in Group A is because his pair of second-place finishes last year was the first time since the beginning of 2010 that he scored a top 5. So not one of his better tracks overall, although he certainly hit the right setup last year.
Okay, well, what else? Any final thoughts about the big race at the Magic Mile? This is one of my favorite tracks. I really do like it. I like the way it's fast. I think the cars have to handle well. I'm interested to see what practice looks like.
Yeah. Well, we didn't get the official picks down in Group C yet either, but
okay,
there I think it's pretty easy. It's Jeff Burton. There's an A and B version of the number 66. He'll be in the A version. He swept the top 10 last year. Chances are good that he's going to finish somewhere around 10th again, or in the low teens. So it's going to be an easy decision to leave Dillon and Larson on the sidelines and pick him up. But if you want to try to swing for the fences, Landon Castle is probably my next Group C driver that I would move up into position 4, and that's because of the 20-something finishes that he got in the last couple of races after missing out at Phoenix. So the top 4 there would be Burton, Dillon, Larson, Castle, but you're not going to think about starting Dillon or Larson this year or this week.
Can you tell us anything about the rookie that you mentioned earlier? And I don't have his name. I forgot to write it down.
Who did I finally decide? I finally decided it was Allgaier.
No, the local guy. I apologize.
Eddie McDonald.
Eddie McDonald. I can't pull his name out of my head.
Yeah, Eddie McDonald. I wouldn't start in Group C. I'm not even sure that Yahoo got him set up yet. We checked that while we were talking. He wasn't there when I wrote the preview, but a lot of times they add the drivers in just right before the end. But even if he is there, I wouldn't pick him in Group C because he's going to finish in the 30s. That's going to leave a lot of room for those 4 drivers I just mentioned to finish ahead of him. So he's going to be interesting to watch. And a lot of times you want to pay as much attention to drivers like that thinking about next year or the next race. If he does well, then he could end up in the ride again, and he could get into the 20s before the fall race starts. And if that's the case, and he is set up now in the Yahoo game, he's there. Looks like the other new guy isn't, though. Clay Rogers is due to make a start this week. He's not there. So, but you still wouldn't want to start him. He's going to finish in the 30s. But if he does well and he gets the ride again for the fall race during the chase, he could be a driver to watch then because you're going to be even more desperate to save allocations for those marquee C drivers. And then he could finish in the 20s. In the 20s, in the fall, in Group C, might not be a bad pick.
All right, there's your make notes, folks, if you're watching. Hopefully you're watching, and you'll join us again next week when we come back and do this. For this week's edition. What are we going to talk about next week? We don't have a cup race next weekend, do we?
We can do a mid-season recap.
We'll do a review. We'll do a mid-season.
Still close enough to the mid-season.
There you go. So stay tuned for that. Watch for the link. This has been our weekly Dan Beaver's Fantasy Pit Stop. I'm Charlie Turner, and he is Dan Beaver. You can follow Dan on Twitter @Fantasy Race. Of course, read his Yahoo story at yahoosports.com. And you can watch replays of this video on pitrow.com, on Pit Row Facebook page, and also on the YouTube page for On Pit Row. So let us know what you think. Leave comments. If there's something specifically you'd like us to talk about, spend a little more time on every week, we'd be happy to try to incorporate that into this. This is your show, and it's all about helping you make the right picks for your NASCAR fantasy racing teams, no matter what game you're playing. So again, I'm Charlie Turner. Thanks for joining us. For Dan Beaver, and we'll see you again next week on Dan Beaver's Fantasy Pit Stop.